11th, 2001, New York woke up like any other Tuesday.
But other than that, it's kind of quiet around the country. We like quiet. It's quiet. It's too quiet. That's a quick look at the Nashville forecast. Here's an early look.
It is beautiful outside. Perfect September day with lots of sunshine.
Yet barely 15 minutes after that broadcaster noted how peaceful New York felt that day. The deadliest act of terrorism of the 21st century had just begun. Although this story does not begin at the exact moment Flight 11 hits the North Tower. It does not even begin when the 19 hijackers arrive at their assigned airports that morning. It starts long before that. It begins with two massive towers built over an entire demolished neighborhood, with a nation obsessed to showcase its economic power to the world, and with decades of conflict, alliances, betrayals, and enemies forming in the shadows. To understand how it all led to September 11, 2001, we must go back in time, both to the origins of what the Twin Towers symbolized and to the origins of where that hatred began. The World Trade Center was a massive financial complex made up of 7 buildings, even including a connected subway station. But its main protagonists and centerpieces were two 110-story towers that dominated and ruled New York's skyline for many years. The idea for the complex came from David Rockefeller, who sought to revitalize a declining at the time financial district. This was when many companies were moving their offices to Midtown or out of New York altogether. The towers were meant to hold those businesses there and to help people believe in the city again. In the early 1960s, he founded the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association and unveiled an ambitious plan to transform the district. In 1962, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey officially took over the project, and it was set on 6.5 hectares along the Hudson River. Because of its scale, the project forced the removal of more than 100 buildings and transformed traffic throughout Lower Manhattan. With the land secured and construction plans advancing, architect Minoru Yamasaki was chosen. He managed to design a tubular system that allowed the towers to rise to great heights, while keeping their vast interiors free of columns. This was achieved by concentrating structural resistance at the perimeter through closely spaced steel columns on the exterior, forming what was essentially a structural exoskeleton. This approach is what shaped the tower's unusual appearance. In addition, there was a central core that housed the elevators and stairwells. This made the buildings extremely rigid, allowing them to withstand strong winds and heavy vertical loads. But it was also a weak point. Because the structures depended on those perimeter columns and on the beams that connected them to the core to remain standing. Another key fact is that at the time the towers were built, the Port Authority did not have to follow or comply with New York City's fire or building codes under city requirements. This is why the complex lacked an automatic fire sprinkler system. The reason was that with so much floor space to cover, it would have been necessary to have a huge water reservoir to feed that sprinkler system. Instead of that, as a safety measure, double plasterboard was installed on some floors. 28 years later, this would partly explain why there was so much dust at the time of its collapse. It should be noted that years later, efforts were made to install a sprinkler system, but the work would not be completed before the attacks. Returning to the construction, the massive excavation made for the foundations came to be known as the bathtub. This was because about 22 meters had to be excavated to reach solid bedrock, plus a structure was built to prevent mud and river water from flooding the site. That excavation produced roughly 916,000 cubic meters of soil, later used to extend the shoreline. The first tower, the North Tower, was completed in December of 1970, briefly becoming the tallest building in the world for a while. The South Tower opened in January 1972, and the entire complex was officially inaugurated on April 4, 1973. Each one had 110 floors and stood about 416 meters tall. They had 104 elevators and over 21,800 windows per tower positioned behind the large steel framework. The complex functioned like a city within the city, with around 50,000 people working there each and every day beyond the countless tourists who came to see them. It was an architectural folly that had been done not once, but twice, although many contemporary critics dismissed them as dull, banal, and unremarkable. The New York Times even called them a revolutionary dinosaur. They said it showcased significant engineering progress, yet seemed largely pointless. In spite of the criticism, the towers rapidly turned into a defining image of New York City, especially among tourists. And that kind of symbolic identity was something New York was missing. Much like the Eiffel Tower in Paris, the Obelisk in Buenos Aires, or the Big Ben in London. Now, New York City had the Twin Towers. They were a cultural symbol, and soon enough they became the backdrop for countless events. For example, in August 1974, the tightrope walker Philippe Petit disguised himself as a construction worker, reached the rooftop of one tower, stretched a steel cable between the two buildings, and walked across it for nearly an hour. Back and forth, despite the intense wind, thousands watched from below, unable to believe what they were seeing, and when he finally came down, he was arrested. The following year, in July 1975, Owen Quinn also sought to prove his skills, and after reaching the top of the North Tower, he jumped off with a parachute. As soon as he touched the ground, he was arrested as well. And the third incident of this kind came in May 1977. When George Willig, an amateur climber, carefully studied and examined the Twin Towers. Then he designed a special metal device to climb the rails of the window cleaning system. Over the course of more than 3 hours, he climbed slowly toward the top, while live television coverage captured the climb and the public watched in amazement. Once he reached the top, he was detained, though authorities ultimately charged him a symbolic fine of 1 cent for each floor he climbed. In total, the fine was $1.10.
My therapist said something to me about a year ago that I still think about almost every single week. Work was a mess and I wasn't sleeping and I had been snapping at people that I care about and then feeling terrible about it, which made me snap more. It was a classic spiral. And I'm sitting in this session listening to everything that's falling apart and she goes, "You keep telling me what's happening to you. I want to know what you're doing with it." To be honest with you, I didn't have an answer and I think that was the point. That one question completely rewired how I think about hard stretches. BetterHelp is how I got there. The sign-up process is disarming in how simple it is. You just answer a questionnaire about your goals, what you're going through, what kind of support you're looking for, and they match you with a therapist from a network of over 30,000 professionals worldwide. I did the whole thing from my couch on a Tuesday night. BetterHelp gives you tools and resources that you can use on your own time, like journaling prompts and worksheets and exercises your therapist can actually reference the next time you talk. I used to think that therapy was something that you save for rock bottom, but the best time to have someone in your corner is before everything falls apart.
As a side note, the day after the climb, he had a drink with tightrope walker Philippe Petit at the restaurant on the 107th floor of one of the towers.
3.5 hours after he began, Willig stood at the pinnacle, waving to a cheering crowd below. Did police greet him with, "You are under arrest," and read him his rights? No, indeed. They said, "Congratulations." They said, after all, that was some climb.
In the 1976 remake of King Kong, the massive gorilla was the one to climb them, marking one of the tower's first appearances in a major film production. In 1979's Meteor, they were obliterated by a meteorite, while in Escape from New York, they doubled as a landing strip. They were also featured in the opening of Late Show with David Letterman, as well as in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and, of course, in Home Alone 2. They were a symbol of New York pride and, of course, a synonym for globalization. Their silhouette and outline dominated the skyline, projecting an image of modernity and economic power. By the late 1980s, the complex had become highly profitable. But that image of strength and prosperity was first shattered on February 26, 1993, when a van loaded with more than 1 ton of explosives detonated in the underground parking garage of the North Tower.
The death trap, let me tell you something. There was smoke where there shouldn't be smoke. I was on the 107th floor, and we heard the bang, and that place filled up in 5 minutes.
The explosion created a crater close to 30 meters wide as smoke rose through the building. 6 people were killed and more than 1,000 were injured, and later investigations revealed that the goal was to bring down one tower so it would collapse onto the other, creating a domino effect. The perpetrators were identified by authorities as members of an Islamic extremist group. One of the main masterminds was Ramzi Youssef, who was later captured in Pakistan. The FBI and the NYPD later identified and arrested several additional individuals involved. Some were arrested in the United States, while others were extradited in the years that followed. But all of them received long prison sentences. The 1993 attack failed to destroy the towers, but it revealed their vulnerability. After repairs were completed and new security measures were put in place, the complex returned to normal operations and continued welcoming thousands of tourists and visitors. Naturally, the Twin Towers remained present throughout mainstream culture. From movies and TV shows to music videos and commercials, the Twin Towers were endlessly used as a symbol of New York. Nothing at the time suggested that within just a few years, they would go from an icon of prosperity to the site of the greatest tragedy in the city's history.
My first touch froze my mother to gold. I was born with golden eyes. When she held me for the first time, her skin hardened beneath my fingers. At 5, I grabbed a pack boy during a game. He froze mid-laugh. At 8, I touched a beggar's last bread. It became pure gold in my hands. The pack called me cursed, but my father called me opportunity. That was the beginning of my doom. Alpha Edward didn't see a child. He saw mine. He burned my palms with hot iron rods, trying to force gold from my skin. Something white sparked before he could break me. And the moon goddess descended.
I am taking the child's blessing. She will take everything from you.
A golden light tore from my hands and vanished into the sky. My power disappeared, but my suffering didn't. Alpha Edward grew afraid, so he handed me to his daughter.
Make her yours. Suppress her before she outshines you.
Marcy obeyed. She didn't me. She ended me slowly. Years of hunger, bruises, chains, servitude. Today, I
But to understand why that symbol became the target of distant hatred, we have to look at the political climate of 2001. George Bush assumed the presidency of the United States on January 20th. Following a highly controversial election in which the margin over Al Gore was so narrow that the result was ultimately decided by the Supreme Court of the United States after weeks of recounts and legal battles in Florida. As a result, Bush entered the White House carrying the perception among many that he had been elected more by a judicial ruling than by the popular vote, because in terms of the popular vote, he had lost. But it is worth remembering that in the United States, elections are decided by key states, not by the total number of individual votes. Al Gore had outpaced Bush by roughly 540,000 votes, and he took office at a time of political and social transition. The previous administration, led by Bill Clinton, had left behind an economy in expansion with low unemployment and growing confidence in technology and globalization. Bush, on the other hand, projected a different profile. He promised tax cuts, a conservative style, and a government focused more on domestic life than on international leadership. His campaign revolved around the idea that the United States should focus on itself and avoid becoming involved in distant conflicts he did not see as a priority. As a result, during the first months of 2001, external threats were not a central concern for his administration. While national security discussions were certainly taking place, they were more focused on traditional concerns, such as the balance of power with China or Russia, rather than international terrorist networks or global terrorism. In addition to this, as a newly installed administration, many key positions in the state apparatus were still adjusting, as the machinery of security, intelligence, and defense underwent that transition. Many officials were still unfamiliar with the full scope of their responsibilities, and lines of communication did not always function efficiently. That lack of coordination is common in the early months of any presidency, but it would prove especially consequential as a major threat was approaching. Beyond that, the United States found itself in a unique position in contemporary history. The Cold War had ended a decade earlier with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, leaving the country without a rival capable of seriously challenging its global leadership. It was the sole undisputed superpower able to project military, economic, and cultural influence across nearly every corner of the globe. Moreover, the swift and decisive victory in the Gulf War in 1991 had demonstrated that its military capabilities far exceeded those of any other force. Culturally, Hollywood, American music, and U.S. sports shaped global trends, while economically, it was a period of prosperity. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, and Google were beginning to emerge as symbols of a country that appeared to be leading the future. Plus, American society was very focused on that progress and on a lifestyle shaped by consumption and innovation. Public concerns revolved around education, healthcare, access to new technologies, and everyday crime in major cities. But international terrorism itself did not occupy a central place in the public agenda. For the average citizen, conflicts in the Middle East or attacks on other continents felt distant, unlikely to disrupt the sense of calm within the United States. And that mindset was also reflected clearly in the way air travel security operated. Flying was a far less restrictive process than the one we know today, and security checks were minimal. For example, passengers could enter the cockpit with relative ease, and there were few thorough screening protocols at airports. The idea that someone might hijack an airplane and use it as a weapon was completely off the radar for both society and security authorities. There is an important clarification to make. By the late 1960s, more than 130 aircraft hijackings were recorded in the United States, a figure that today seems almost impossible to imagine. But the phenomenon was not yet tied to terrorism as we understand it today, and was instead driven by political, personal, or even economic motives. The approach was almost identical. A single person, often armed only with a handgun, or even just a note claiming there was an explosive, would stand up mid-flight and force a change in direction. In most cases, including some that occurred in Argentina, the destination was Fidel Castro's Cuba, which for some represented a promised land. For others, it served as a political platform to challenge the United States government. Most hijackers were not trying to destroy the aircraft or harm passengers, but simply to divert the flight elsewhere. How the idea of sacrificing one's life for an ideal took shape is explored in another video on the channel. Returning to the early 2000s, while the United States saw itself as a nation at its peak, its policy in the Middle East had been generating tensions since the previous decade. Since the end of the Gulf War in 1991, U.S. troops had remained stationed in Saudi Arabia. Officially, the mission was to ensure regional stability and protect the kingdom from potential aggression by Iraq. Across much of the Islamic world, that military presence was interpreted as a direct intrusion into sacred territory or lands. At the same time, the economic sanctions imposed on Iraq after the war remained in place throughout the decade. The United States, along with its allies, justified those measures as a way to pressure the regime of Saddam Hussein and prevent the development of weapons of mass destruction. In reality, however, the sanctions had devastating consequences for civilians, limiting access to food and medicine and basic goods. That humanitarian cost fueled a deeply negative perception of Washington across the Arab world, reinforcing the idea that the United States acted with impunity and punished entire populations to preserve its dominance. Each time Saddam Hussein was accused of violating United Nations resolutions or obstructing international inspectors, the U.S. response took the form of airstrikes. Another key aspect was the support the United States provided Israel within the context of the conflict with Palestine. The Oslo Accords had provided a breather and hope for peace, but the failure of the negotiations and the outbreak of the Second Intifada ultimately worsened the situation. Taken into account together, these factors led many political and religious leaders in the Middle East to view the United States as a direct enemy. That negative image became fertile ground for radical movements, which began to shape their ideology around the idea of directly confronting American power on a global scale. In that environment, the figure of a man began to emerge, shaped by the war in Afghanistan and having turned its mountains into the ideal refuge to organize a network that would soon make headlines around the world: Osama bin Laden.
This is a sign to ditch the instant coffee. This is way better. You see, coffee should be one of the healthiest things in our...
Osama bin Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden was born in 1957 in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, into one of the country's wealthiest and most influential families. He was the son of Mohammed bin Laden, a Yemeni immigrant who built a vast construction empire through lucrative contracts with the Saudi royal family. With more than 50 children from different wives, the bin Laden family became a powerful clan of magnates where immense wealth coexisted with strict religiosity. Osama grew up surrounded by privilege and money, yet from an early age, he set himself apart from many of his siblings. While much of the family embraced a cosmopolitan lifestyle, traveling through Europe and enjoying luxury, Osama gravitated towards austerity and the strict practice of Islam. He studied at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, where he encountered preachers who promoted a strict interpretation of Islam rooted in Wahhabism, Saudi Arabia's dominant religious doctrine. These influences shaped a deeply militant religious outlook from an early age. During his university years, he became increasingly interested in Islamic politics and the conflicts affecting the Arab world. For him, religion was not meant to be limited to private life. It was meant to be a structure or foundation to society and politics. That worldview would radicalize even further after a key event that would define his life: the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. At the time, Osama was just 22 years old and chose to devote his fortune and energy to the cause of the Mujahideen, the Islamic fighters seeking to expel the invader. He traveled to Pakistan and then to Afghanistan, where he began building contacts, financing training camps, and organizing the arrival of Arab volunteers eager to join the war. He was not a skilled battlefield strategist, but his wealth, family name, and organizational ability quickly earned him respect. Gradually, he emerged as a reference point for the idea of global jihad, an ideology that crossed national borders to promote a unified Islamic struggle against foreign occupation. This period fueled an idea that would later be repeated many times, that Osama bin Laden was a product of the United States. But, as always, reality is far more complex. It is true that the Central Intelligence Agency funded and trained Afghan Mujahideen as part of Operation Cyclone during the Cold War against the Soviets. But bin Laden didn't work directly with the CIA, nor was he an American agent. He functioned independently. His organization, resources, and fighters were independent, but they shared a common enemy, the Soviet Union, and therefore benefited from Western support. And the Soviet withdrawal in 1989 left bin Laden with immense prestige within Islamist circles. He had taken part in what was seen as a victory of Islam over a global superpower. For him, the experience proved that a group of motivated fighters could defeat armies that appeared invincible. If that had been possible, he believed the United States could also be confronted and worn down. Although the war had ended, for Osama bin Laden it marked only the beginning of a much larger project. Alongside close collaborators including Abdullah Azzam and later Ayman al-Zawahiri, he shaped a network aimed at keeping jihad active on an international scale. He named it Al-Qaeda, which in Arabic means the base. Al-Qaeda was not a traditional army.